here. Yes. Yes. All right, you ready to start back up again? We'll try to get this all wrapped up with our exploration of rethinking the Gospel of Luke, rethinking Luke's identity and the identity of his recipient. You have a question?
Do you mind maybe outlining a timeline of, you got Luke writing 2 major texts of the New Testament. What do you think the duration is from his getting involved in the movement and then finally finishing off Acts?
I think Acts covers basically a 30-year period from just after the crucifixion of Jesus and the ascension all the way to about 62, 64 at the latest. So that would be a roughly 30-year period. And then the gospel is 28 to 30. Luke is writing about it a little bit later. You can see that because many have already written narratives. It's not immediately after. Others have taken time. So then the position, the hypothesis I'm presenting now is that Luke is himself an eyewitness from the beginning that he was there. He was a follower of Jesus, may possibly be one of the 70. We'll explore that here, which would put him there, not as I used to argue. I may have argued in one of the previous weekends that that John's gospel is an eyewitness. Matthew was an eyewitness. Mark is the translator of Peter. He's recording Peter's eyewitness. Luke is the follower of Paul, and it's apostolic because it's in the circle of Paul. That's what I have argued. What I'm saying now is after having investigated the prologue in its original languages, looking here at various texts, I think it's plausible and possibly even probable that Luke is claiming to have been an eyewitness from the beginning. In this particular passage here, looking at the words in Greek, when he makes this transition from the general, what happened in general with the general eyewitnesses, now he's making the specific application to Theophilus. He's telling Theophilus, here's what I'm going to do for you. Everything accurately and orderly for you to write, most noble Theophilus. So he's now transitioning to what he's going to do for Theophilus. Some of the words that come up here, the word all relates to the word all over here, everything. In the first book of Theophilus, I have dealt with all that Jesus began to do and teach. Henry Cadbury says that the word pasin here, the word all, suggests the object for graphsai, which is the everything to write. Some people have, having been a witness of everything from the beginning, which would mean having investigated everything. It may not be that way. It may be the word everything relates to all that he's going to write. And I think, having looked at the grammar, I think that's the better explanation of where the word all fits. He's there from the beginning, and he's going to write everything orderly for Theophilus. Not that he's a witness of everything. I don't think he is a witness of everything. Especially if he's Lucius from Cyrene. He may have been a follower from the beginning, that first year, but he may not have seen everything. And there are reasons for that. I don't think he ever speaks first person like John does, especially about the crucial things like the resurrection. He leans on the eyewitnesses of the apostles, which would also make sense if he's one of the 70. You're going to defer to the primary apostle. All right, so Acts 24, look at this language here from 24-22. Felix, having rather accurate knowledge of the way, said, when Lysias the tribune comes down, I will decide your case. So that accurate knowledge is what he is presenting to Theophilus. So this is in a court case, we're going to decide your case with accuracy. So over here, this accuracy language, I'm going to write everything accurately. I think it really fits in a legal context, in a public affidavit kind of a context. Acts 11:4. Peter explained it to them in order from the beginning. Wow, that's pretty clear. He's going to organize the narrative of he's organizing it, the events in order. He's there in that context, talking about the events, his dream. He's organizing the story. He's telling it from the beginning in order. Again, this is the same kind of language that Luke has in the prologue. Acts 23. To the most excellent Governor Felix. Okay, so we've seen examples of the most excellent presented that in the video. We see it in a broader use. Josephus uses this word of the aristocracy, and of the aristocracy of that day. He says very clearly that once Herod and Archelaus are no longer kings, the government became an aristocracy. The Judean government was an aristocracy. So what you have to think of as Pontius Pilate is the governor for Roman affairs. And the high priesthood, the Sanhedrin, is sort of this broader Judean aristocracy that, because it's a theocracy, right? It's not just Roman law here. The Romans are going to take care of Roman law stuff, but the Jewish folks are going to take care of Jewish law stuff. And it's not just religion. It's the entire management of the nation, which was a Jewish theocracy. So laws of the state were religious laws. We think in terms of separation of church and state, but the high priests of the period were often religious officials. That idea of a high priest, they had one in all of the ancient Roman and Greco-Roman world. They were high priests, and they had both religious and secular functions. And they were most noble. They were very high positions of authority. So even the Roman emperor was called Pontifex Maximus. The Roman emperor was the high priest because he's the highest official. That kind of understanding goes back all the way to ancient Egypt. The pharaoh was the highest authority of the state and of religion, who was often thought of as the son of God. You find that language too among the emperors. And so you have this most excellent Theophilus, which would be the term, that would be the way you would say it in Greek for the high priest. I've got lots of examples of that. And there's the Talmud quote, it's the same name and same title, and I think that's a very, very good way to at least give plausibility. She says almost certain. Identification can be almost certain in the cases where the person's identified here, not only the same name, but the same title. I think that's pretty good for my case. I have reached out to Tal a little and she hasn't responded. So she's busy. Maybe she doesn't want to chime in yet. I don't know, but it'd be great if she would eventually chime in. I'm going to put a bug in Peter Bull's ear. He's the Australian New Testament scholar who I've been talking with, who's advocating the same hypothesis. I want to have him write up a scholarly article and then try to get Tal along to comment. All right, verse 4. The certainty of the things you've been told, in order that you may know concerning what you have been told things, the certainty. That certainty language, to me, shows something important. He's addressing something that's happening in Theophilus' mind. Theophilus, I think, is uncertain. He's uncertain, but that doesn't really fit if he's a Gentile disciple who is not a new convert. I mean, unless he's been a disciple for a long time, knows all these different things, but is uncertain about it. And then he doesn't write him an epistle. Here are the reasons why things are certain. He just tells him the story of Jesus from the beginning. It's weird. It doesn't really fit. All right, so here are some of the texts that relate, some of the words that come up in Luke's writing. This Jesus, Acts 2, Peter's sermon. This Jesus God raised up, and of that we are witnesses. Let all the house of Israel therefore know for certain, same kind of language, know for certain, that God has made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified. Thus, Luke has provided for Theophilus the very thing Peter provided for the house of Israel. This is why I say you read the speeches and you get all the themes of the prologue. Let Israel know. Guess what? What if Luke is writing to Israel's high priest? You can know for certain just like Peter said in his speech. Acts 21, they have been informed about you, that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses. Informed. This is the language that we find in Acts 21, and the word there is katekeo, and a lot of times that word katekeo is translated instruct, is taught, the things you've been taught, the things you've been instructed, because it's katekeo. We get our word catechism from it. But sometimes we read our later usage into earlier practice. If you look at Acts 21, it just is translated told, the things you've been told. And sometimes it's the word told incorrectly. Like you have opinions, things you were told, and we're going to correct the record. And so what if that's what he's saying here? That Theophilus says, I'm going to give you certainty about the things you've been told. He's heard it from a lot of different sources. And some of the things you're not sure about. Here's what really happened from the closest witnesses. Verse 24 of Acts 21, take them and be purified so all may know those things of which they were told, another translation, informed about concerning you are nothing. So it's not really taught, it's more like common knowledge, which is why I think it fits with Theophilus is one of those people among whom these things happen, at least in a national sense. The Caesareans, you yourselves know these things. Okay, the people at Caesarea weren't necessarily there for everything Jesus did, but Jesus it was common knowledge. And so you can know some things, but then if you know some things, I saw a few weird things that Jesus did in this one city, but I don't know that he was raised from the dead. I'm not going to be certain about that. And his closest eyewitnesses who are with him the whole time are going to fill in the gaps. Awesome. Josephus. King Agrippa to Josephus, his dear friend, sends greetings. So this is Josephus including a letter from King Agrippa, a biblical character. We have the words of King Agrippa to Josephus. We have an extra piece of information about Agrippa. King Agrippa to Josephus, his dear friend, sends greetings. It seems by what you have written that you are indeed in need of no instruction in order to learn our information. He uses a different word there for instruction than he does not use the word katekeo there. Of our information from the beginning. Notice there, from the beginning. However, when you come to me, I will inform you, there's the word katekeo, of a great many things you do not know. That fits really well with the kind of thing that Luke is writing to Theophilus. Things you've been informed and told about. I'm going to give you more information so you can have certainty. Okay, so here is sort of the way I have now come to think of the prologue. Rightly dividing it, first two verses, many witnesses have seen, and they're speaking to Israel, and Luke's witness to Theophilus. So this is the general and broad, and this is the more specific. And then we'll kind of go through this verse by verse. This is my translation. Inasmuch as many have endeavored each to set in order an account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, I probably would add completely fulfilled among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and guardians of the word delivered to us. It seemed good also to me, as one who has been a follower from the beginning, to write everything, notice how this is permitted to write everything accurately and in order for you, most powerful, I might say, Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you've been told. What do you think? Does that change the way? This is my reflection on it after having wrestled with the Greek, but it seems this translation is a little bit more conducive to the proposal I'm presenting. So we have, many have endeavored to set in order a narrative concerning the events fulfilled among us. This is a very interesting word I'll talk about. Concerning the things you've been told. Notice how concerning the events fulfilled among us and concerning. This is relating to this. Many have done this. Many have endeavored. It seemed good to me. To set in order a narrative, to write an orderly report. Concerning the events fulfilled among us concerning the things you've been told. You see the parallel? The things that are happening in general over here, he's going to do for Theophilus. And once you figure that out, just as eyewitnesses delivered from the beginning, delivered to us, Luke, a follower from the beginning, delivers to Theophilus. To me, this makes better sense of the prologue, and it secures the Gospel of Luke as a very early eyewitness, a physically present disciple of Jesus. The eyewitnesses were guardians of the word. Theophilus can have certainty since Luke himself was physically present. This, by the way, is logos. Some have argued that that can mean the word, Jesus himself. It could also mean, it could be open to the word of the gospel, the transmission of the thing you deliver. I'm open to both interpretations. It could just be one general statement of Jesus and his message. I'm not sure. So this part here, as I think, is really super interesting because you have the same word in both cases concerning what? Concerning the things completely fulfilled among us, concerning the things you've been told, kind of implies to me, if this is in parallel, that both Luke and Theophilus are included in that we statement. Because Theophilus is an Israelite among whom these things happened, and that's why he's been told about these things. He's heard about them. He may have even heard it from his own granddaughter. Now, look at the way this word katecheo is used. That relates to what people have been told. We've talked about that. Here, we talk about the among us language, John 1:14, the things that have been completely fulfilled among us matches the language from John's prologue, that the word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we are witnesses. Same kind of thing in the prologue of John's gospel. He's emphasizing his eyewitness activity, his eyewitness perspective. Men of Israel, Peter says in Acts chapter 2, hear these things. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you. This is attested, it's corroborated, it's eyewitness, it's certainty. Attested to you by God with mighty wonders and works. Who? To the Israelites, because he was there, not just only by word of mouth. He's attested how? By signs and wonders, as evidence that God did through him in your midst. In your midst. It's that sort of, in this case, he's not excluding himself. He himself claims to be a witness, but he's talking to them about what they have seen with their eyes. And that's the same language you find in the prologue with a we statement. Acts 10, you yourselves know what happened throughout all Judea, beginning from Galilee after the baptism of John, proclaimed how God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and power, and we are witnesses of all that he did, both in the country of the Jews and Jerusalem. So that, again, when you start seeing the patterns, it all sort of fits the language of the prologue. Acts 26, for the king knows about these things, for this has not been done in a corner. He tells this to Agrippa in front of Agrippa and Festus. That idea that it's not done in a corner is why he keeps saying over and over, as you yourselves know. And that's what Luke is summarizing in the prologue, the things that have been fulfilled among us. And among all the Judeans, just like he says over and over again. Okay, let's change gears a bit here. I want to talk about some of the ways that some of the information we have about Luke in church history. A lot of people say that Luke is a disciple of Paul from early church history. We find, I think in the, let's see, there's a 2nd century text, and the name escapes me. Moratorian canon says that he was a disciple of the apostles, that he was not a witness. This, however, has to be taken in conjunction with other arguments that he was. For example, this particular document, which is called the Anti-Marcionite Prologue, it's short pieces, short prefaces to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. Matthew, only Mark, Luke, and John. Originally in Greek, but only Luke's prologue survives in its original language. Many scholars date these texts to the 2nd century, including F.F. Bruce and Adolf von Harnack. So you have, moderate to conservative and then hard liberal. Although von Harnack, as we'll see, ended up changing his view of the dating of Luke and Acts. Luke is identified in this text as the holy apostle and evangelist. You can see that right here. It's right there. Can't you see it? This is the word holy, hagia, and then this is aposto, and this is an abbreviation showing it's contracted, and this is Lukos. Luca. And so it calls him the Holy Apostle, which is weird, because that's not very common. And if you look this up, like, do the anti-Marcionite prologues mention Luke as the Holy Apostle? It doesn't say it, but this is what it says here in Greek. And if you look up anti-Marcionite prologue Wikipedia, you'll get this page with this image, so you can look at it carefully. But it also says that he is from Antioch in Syria and was a physician by art. Again, maybe as early as 160. This Luke was a disciple of the apostles, who later accompanied Paul until his martyrdom. So how can he be a holy apostle, but also a disciple of the apostles? The theory that I'm presenting, I think he could be both. Certainly, if he's a disciple of the apostles, that word could be taken in a couple different ways. He could be a disciple of or a disciple among. That in Greek, those were both options. And he is certainly in the midst of if he's a 70, you could think of the 70s as under the 12. So the disciple among the 12. All right, here are the earliest reference to Luke being among the 70 or the 72. Sometimes it says 70, sometimes others refer to the 72. The ESV says 72. Luke was one of the 72 who had been scattered because of the Savior's teaching. This is the earliest reference I could find is Epiphanius of Salamis from 372. That's 4th century. It's not that early. Which is one of the reasons I like the earlier text here that calls him an apostle. The question is, what's an apostle? And we'll have to get into that. Now, look at Luke's gospel. We have chapter 6. Jesus called his disciples and chose from them 12 whom he named apostles. So there's a distinction between apostles and disciples. There's a broader group of disciples from which he names 12. By the way, I think the Sermon on the Mount, if you look at it closely, he calls his disciples to him. He sits down and then preaches to them. I think the Sermon on the Mount is an ordination sermon for the apostles. One way to think about it. And I think it was on the top of Mount Arbel. I'll show you a picture of that sometime. It's overlooking the Sea of Galilee. Compare this to the Gospel of Luke. Look at chapter 10. The Lord appointed 72. This word appointed, it's the same word that comes up in Acts 1:24, when one of the 12 replaced Judas. He was appointed. Okay? So Jesus appoints 72 others and sent them on ahead. It doesn't say that he named them apostles, but he uses the same word, apostello. You have the verb form to send. You have the noun form, epistle or apostle. Epistle, apostle. You send a letter, you send a person. Epistle, apostle. So that the 72 are not called apostles, but they were sent. And they were told specifically, go ahead 2 by 2, every town. It's interesting. Only Luke mentions this, which is interesting, isn't it? That he sends 72. To a town place where he himself was about to go, the one who hears you hears me, and the one who rejects you rejects me, and the one who rejects me rejects him who sent me. If we are establishing that Luke was commissioned by Jesus as a herald who has Jesus' words, it makes him a perfect candidate to be an evangelist. He's an eyewitness commissioned. He's an apostle in the sense of a lowercase a, someone sent, commissioned and sent by Jesus. And I think we do have that category in the later epistles of different people who are apostles, but who are not the 12. And we'll look at some of those. Here are some of the implications. By the way, here's another ancient depiction of Luke. Guess what you see? Another cow. Holy cow. If Luke was one of the 72, this could explain why he was called a holy apostle as well as disciple of or among the apostles. In 1 Corinthians 15, we're told that Jesus appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500, then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles. Wait, he already appeared to the apostles. What is going on? Get your facts straight, Paul. Who are these other? Wait, Paul too was an apostle. That's weird. Okay, so he appears to the 12, but Paul wasn't the one who replaced Judas. So he's an apostle. Who are these other apostles? I think the other apostles are those who were commissioned in a... If you think about the Jewish world, they had the Sanhedrin. Guess what? How many in the Sanhedrin? 72. But there are also lower Sanhedrins. There was the primary Sanhedrin, and there were 3 different levels of Sanhedrins, and one did more local stuff. It's kind of like lower court, federal court, Supreme Court, that kind of. So you could have the 12 apostles are the Supreme Court of the apostles. And yet there are other apostles, others commissioned by Jesus. Certainly Paul, we see the language of Jesus' commissioning of Paul, not to replace any of the 12, but he's commissioned. You will be my witness and officer. I think Luke may have been commissioned the same way. Acts 11. Now those who were scattered because of the persecution that arose over Stephen traveled as far as Phoenicia and Cyprus. We looked earlier at Acts 8 and then Acts 9. And we saw how they're in Jerusalem, they're leaving to go to Judea and Samaria. And then in Acts 9, they're going further out. And Paul is going as far as Damascus. Now in chapter 11, we're told, because of the persecution that happened starting with Stephen, the saints traveled as far as Phoenicia, that's Lebanon, and Cyprus, that's the island, and Antioch. So the saints are traveling to Antioch. That's the first reference we have to Antioch. Speaking the word to no one except to Jews. Ooh, interesting. We don't yet have a Gentile evangelism yet. Everywhere they go, they're speaking to Jewish audiences. Which, if Luke is in this scenario, that would be what? But there were some of them, men of Cyprus and Cyrene, ooh, that's an interesting reference there, who coming to Antioch spoke to the Hellenists. This, we know, cannot be interpreted as Greeks in terms of Gentiles. It's Greek-speaking Jews, because this verse makes clear. So the Hellenists are Greek-speaking Jews. They typically went to Jewish synagogues, Greek-speaking synagogues. There's one in Jerusalem. We found the inscription of Theodosius, the Theodotus inscription. There was a synagogue dedicated for Greek-speaking Jews. What happened when you would be a slave in some part of the empire, and then you would get your freedom, and then you'd come to Jerusalem, but your native tongue would be Greek. So you come, but you don't understand the language of Aramaic very well, so you had Greek-speaking synagogues. And so that's what you find in Acts 6, the difference between the Hellenists and the Hebrews, which is a language differentiation. Okay, so they, who on coming to Antioch spoke to the Hellenists also, preaching the Lord Jesus, and a great number believed. The report of this came to the ears of the church in Jerusalem, and they sent Barnabas to Antioch, okay? So a lot of people are believing. The people in Jerusalem see, okay, wow, there's a big movement happening. We need to send one of the officials. If you look at Barnabas, he's very early on Acts 4, I think, is the first time his name comes up. He's obviously somebody who's not a recent convert. He had some weight in the early church. They sent him on a commission to make sure everything's good. He also was connected with Paul. Once Paul was converted, he went to Barnabas. He was one of the early guys there. That's why they were related so often in the book of Acts. When he came and saw the grace of God, he was glad and exhorted them all to remain faithful. Later, he went to Tarsus to look for Saul to bring him. And then in chapter 13, we see that Saul comes to Antioch, stays. He's one of the teaching elders there. And when he found him, he brought him to Antioch. For a whole year, they met with the church and taught a great many people. And in Antioch, the disciples were first called Christians. Very significant. Now, in these days, there came down prophets from Jerusalem unto Antioch, Codex Beza, and there was much rejoicing. And when this is that first we statement. So here, Luke seems to be including himself. And we have this interesting background that relates to the expulsion of the Jews, related to starting with the persecution of Stephen, which is very early. We're talking 32, 33, 30, somewhere in that zone. It's when it starts, because the persecution of Stephen is when Paul is still persecuting. And then just after this, then Paul's converted, so we're talking 34, 35, unless the older dating of the crucifixion takes place. But very, very early. So whoever this we is, if this is Luke, he is including himself in that passage, which I think is very reasonable. There are a lot of scholars who've argued this, scholars whose names you would recognize, who do agree that Western reading is authentic. Next slide. The church in Antioch, according to Acts 13:1, Lucius of Cyrene was one of the leaders of the church of Antioch. And I mentioned that verse. He's there with Manaen and Saul and Simeon and Barnabas. The fact that Lucius is associated with Saul or Paul here as one of the leaders of the church at Antioch is an argument, I argue, in favor of identifying him with the evangelist, because you have a very good association. They're co-laborers. He's a co-laborer. This Lucius of Cyrene is a co-laborer with Paul. This verse also makes it clear that he wasn't a recent convert. Okay? He's not a recent convert. And this would be sometime between 33 and 37. In other words, to be installed as a leader of the church in Antioch at that time essentially requires him, especially in light of the language of you who've been with me from the beginning will be my ministers and witnesses and officers. It requires him to have been a follower of Jesus in the days of his earthly ministry. You're not going to have somebody be a teacher of Jesus in those days unless he was originally. He's not. I mean, that is common for us to have teachers of Jesus who didn't know Jesus. But in that day, you're going to have a teacher of Jesus who knew Jesus. Notice the language here from other texts. When the Helper comes, whom I will send you from the Father, he will bear witness about me, and you will also bear witness because you've been with me from the beginning. So we've talked about that one. Luke 1:2. Those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. Okay, so that sounds like they fit together. Acts 1. Some of the men who had accompanied us during all the time that the Lord Jesus had went in and out among us, beginning from the baptism of John, one of these must become a witness with us of his resurrection. This is the part that I think is the key part of the replacing of the 12. Somebody who was an eyewitness of the resurrection, and I'm not sure, I haven't found anything in my reading of Luke's material that shows that he was a witness of the resurrection. He seems to include other witnesses, unless he's one of the two men, unnamed, on the road to Emmaus. Some argue that. But I just think he was involved in the circle from the beginning. I think that's what he's claiming. I was a follower from the beginning, from the earliest days. Perhaps he was one of these guys who came to Judea from Cyrene and followed John the Baptist and saw the connection from those earlier days? Who knows? Acts 10 again, you yourself know what happened throughout all Judea, beginning from it's just that language from the beginning is so clear. All right, let's transition now to focusing on the implications for the dating of Luke and Acts. The dating of Luke and Acts. Notice what Paul says here in 1 Timothy 5:18. For the scripture says, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain, for the laborer deserves his wages. He's quoting there from Leviticus, calling it scripture. Scripture, by the way, is a reference to written texts. But in the second breath, he says the laborer deserves his wages, which is not a quote from Leviticus, but is a quote from the Gospel of Luke. So Paul, in basically people typically date 1 Timothy to the early 60s, although Peter Bolt is making a case that it's a little earlier. He hasn't written it up yet, but he told me that he's arguing it. So in the early 60s, we have a reference to Luke as already written. Luke 10, after this, the Lord appointed 72 others, and this is the scene in which he appoints the 72. They go to town, and then Jesus says, whatever house you enter, eat and drink what they provide, for the laborer deserves his wages. The section that he quotes, Paul is quoting here from the part where the 72 were commissioned, and he's specifically quoting this. Now, there is a similar verse that Matthew uses, but instead of saying the laborer deserves his wages, it says the laborer deserves his food. And so the language that Paul uses matches Luke's gospel. And Matthew's gospel doesn't distinguish between the commissioning of the 12 and the commissioning of the 72. Luke does. 1 Corinthians 9 is really interesting because this is earlier. Daniel Wallace dates this to, I think, mid-50s, and as far as I can see, someone like Jonathan Bernier says 50 to 56. And I tend to move things earlier. I think it makes more sense, especially if Luke calls it scripture, if Paul calls it scripture, it can't have been recently adopted, just last Thursday in the early 60s. So 1 Corinthians 9, am I not an apostle? Have I not seen our Lord Jesus? Notice that language. To be an apostle, someone commissioned requires physical presence. And Luke was, as we saw, called a holy apostle in that one document. Are you not my workmanship in the Lord? Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Do I say these things on human authority? No. Does not the law say the same thing? The law. For it is written, you shall not muzzle an ox. Same passage. In the same way, the Lord also commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. He's here not quoting the verse verbatim, but he's summarizing the verse. It seems like it's been a proof text that he's been using for a long time. The contrast between Leviticus and Luke, and this in a text that is written in the 50s. Notice what he does a couple chapters later. For I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you. That reception and delivering. We know delivering does not mean handed down across generations. It means handed over. That the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took bread, saying, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Guess what? He's using Luke's language. In the same way, he also took the cup. That is specifically the new covenant in my blood. And there's just, of all the Gospels, if you look at it carefully and look at the language in the English or in Greek, it definitely mirrors the language we find in Luke's narrative. So a couple different passages here shows this, though this is not explicitly Lucan, because he summarizes that, the way he uses this argument matches what he does connect there later, and it matches the Lucan narrative here. Now, you go back to an earlier text in Galatians 46 to 48, let the one who is taught the word share all the good things with the one who teaches. Guess what? He's got that same theme. Where did he get it from? He got it from Jesus. And he's summarizing it there, but it's the same teaching material. This is the oldest copy that we have of Luke. There are a lot of people who say, you know, the earliest Gospels, as they're circulating, whenever the Gospels were written, they're anonymous. You don't find the names. Take a look at this copy. That says Kata Lukan, according to Luke. And this right here says Yohanan. So right there. So ending of Luke, the beginning of John. It is interesting here in this copy that a lot of people date to 200 or so. Philip Comfort dates as early as 160. He says 160, 180, mid to late second century. I like Philip Comfort's dating, and this is based on things like handwriting analysis. Philip Comfort is not a hard conservative, he's a moderate scholar, but he dates this maybe middle second century. But notice the ending of Luke and then the beginning of John, same order we have. And there's a reason for that. It goes back to early period. Why would you separate Luke and Acts? Well, you've got to come up with an explanation for that. If Luke is the last gospel, why not put Acts right next to that? My guess is it has something to do with the fact that the order that we find relates to the order that they were sort of received into the life of the church. And that John is the next gospel to have been sort of admitted into the collective body and consciousness of the church. And then that's why Acts interrupts the narrative. The brother who is famous for the gospel, this is a fast, so the people who argue that the gospels were distributed anonymously, there's been a lot of good work on this. This is very common for the Bart Ehrmans of the world to say. We don't know. They don't even have their names on them. Well, it's pretty common for texts to not mention the author's name in the preface. But what you did, you had scrolls, and you'd have like an identification tag in the library that would say the author's name, but it wouldn't necessarily be in the preface because it's assumed that you know already. So a lot of times you don't have scroll or fragments of scrolls because we don't even have the beginning. But the ones we do have from the very earliest and from the wide geographical area, if we had no name and you have people guessing, you'd have a lot of different candidates. We only have one candidate for this gospel, and that's Luke. No other names are suggested. And but we also have fairly early evidence that this gospel was attributed to Luke and that one was attributed to John from very early periods. And from, again, a wide geographic radius. All right. 2 Corinthians 8 says, with Titus we are sending the brother who is famous among all the churches for his preaching of the gospel. That's what the ESV says. But when you look at the text in the original Greek, it says, the brother who is famous in the gospel, famous in all the churches. The brother who's famous in all the churches because of the gospel, probably the better way to translate that. Dative of cause being the grammatical way to interpret this, which is definitely a classic thing. Daniel Wallace, Greek professor, has that way of reading this kind of a verse. So this passage is talking about, this is somewhere between 50 and 56, and it's not even mentioning the person's name because he's so well known, like the person who's famous for the gospel. Who would that be? Well, a lot of people in the early church argued that that was Luke. Not only that, but he has been appointed by the churches to travel with us. Okay, it's a traveling partner of Paul. And Paul has all kinds of gospel passages from Luke's gospel memorized in his head. He quotes over and over again. He's traveling with Paul, and to carry out this act of grace that is being ministered to us for the glory of the Lord himself and to show our goodwill. So it is speculative to connect that to Luke, but I don't know. I think it's at least plausible. All right. Raise your hand if you're familiar with this guy, Adolf von Harnack. Okay. This guy, hard, liberal, radical, not a good friend of classical Christianity, German liberal critic. Okay. This guy is not a friend of Christianity, and yet In 1909, he wrote this book on the Acts of the Apostles, and in 1911, he wrote this book, The Date of the Acts, and he doesn't come to conservative theological opinions, but he does come to conservative views about the dating of Acts and the Synoptics as a result. Just listen to some of the language here. How remarkable is it that a vivacious storyteller like Luke should remain so objective that simply because he's dealing with the times of the War of 66 AD, he gives no hint of the tremendous change that came with the year 70. Though in Acts 11:28, he expressly notices that the prophecy of the Jerusalem famine was actually fulfilled in the reign of Claudius, yet this historian nowhere says that the prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem was fulfilled by Titus, and does not think of referring to the terrible judgment that had actually come upon the nation. So he notices this absence, that line in Acts 11, the Agabus, the prophet, foretold that there would be a famine. And then he says, and this was fulfilled in the days of the days of Claudius. That is a narrative comment by Luke showing that Agabus' prophecy came true a little later. It also shows he's writing after the days of Claudius, right? It happened in the days of Claudius. Looking back, you can find something out about his language. He didn't write during the days of Claudius. It was fulfilled in the days of Claudius. Why would he take the time to show the fulfillment of Agabus' prophecy, but not Jesus? Adolf von Harnack is making this point. It's astounding that this wasn't picked up. Now look what 2 years later, he gets even more clear. The more clearly we see that the trial of Paul, and above all his appeal to Caesar, is the chief subject of the last 25% of the book of Acts, the more hopeless does it appear that he can explain why the narrative breaks off as it does without a resolution to the trial. The more hopeless, where it does. Otherwise, than by assuming that the trial had actually not yet reached its close. It is no use to struggle against this conclusion. If St. Luke, in the year 80, 90, or 100, wrote thus, he was not simply a blundering, but an absolute incomprehensible historian! Exclamation point! Not only is the slightest reference to the outcome of the trial of St. Paul absent from the book, but not even a trace is to be discovered of the rebellion of the Jews in the 7th decade of the century, 70 AD, or the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, of Nero's persecution of the Christians. Wow, I haven't thought about the implications of that until recently. 64, remember what Tacitus says about the Jews, about the persecution? Well, I have a slide that talks about it. Nero's persecution of Christians and of other important events that occurred in the 7th decade of the 1st century. He's making an argument of absence, but that particular series of absences is really provocative. And the fact that it comes from Adolf van Harnack is super interesting. Here's a Yale scholar by the name of Charles Cutler-Torrey. It is perhaps conceivable that one evangelist writing after the year 70 might fail to allude to the destruction of the temple by the Romans. Every reader of the Hebrew Bible knew that the prophets had definitively predicted that foreign armies would surround the city and destroy it. But that 3 or 4 should thus fail is quite incredible. Yale scholar, 1940. So these are minority voices. The major voice throughout the 1800s and 1900s. These are all late, and so these people they're not conservative scholars, but they're reacting against it, asking questions. Professor Colombo, I got a question for you. If that's right, it appears, Bo Ricci says, in 1962, University of Basel professor, that the author had completed his account of the events which had taken place soon after the conclusion of a 2-year period, say 63, 64. For if Luke had written at a considerably later date, more would surely have been said about Paul. There is not the slightest suggestion in the existing text of Paul's later fate and his martyrdom in connection with the persecution of Nero. A natural inclusion if the book had been written later. The only simple and straightforward explanation is of its abrupt conclusion is to assume that it was written soon after the end of the period which it describes. So Paul arrives in Rome, he's in house arrest, and he's speaking freely to anyone about the kingdom of God.
except for the fact that a year or so later, Nero rounds up an innumerable multitude and lights them on fire and persecution. It's like, you're going to end the story to Theophilus and leave that bit out? You forgot about that part. That's sort of, this is propaganda is what it is. You're not telling the full story, Luke. If you knew about it, why did you not tell the fact that, wait a minute, it's even better. Paul gets on trial before Nero and is exonerated and set free. And then he goes to Spain, and then he comes back. Oh, then it gets worse. He's captured again, put on trial again, and then he's executed. Why is it all missing from the narrative? Why is the destruction of Rome, 70% of the city is burned? Lots of innumerable multitudes are captured and tortured. That's not put in here. You find it in the other Christian writings. This Rome burned, Jerusalem destroyed. Very interesting. If this suggestion does not harmonize with the commonly accepted views of the origin of the Synoptic Gospels, oh wait, I missed a sentence. The only simple and straightforward explanation of its abrupt conclusion is to assume it was written soon after the end of the period it describes. If this suggestion does not harmonize with the commonly accepted views of the origin of the Synoptics, we shall have to change our view of these. So the problem is with dating Acts early, is we know that Luke's Gospel was written before Acts. In my former volume, Theophilus. And we know that Matthew and Mark are written before Luke, because Luke mentions the other sources many have undertaken, and most everybody says that certainly Matthew and Mark are before. That means Matthew, Mark, and Luke are before Acts. So the dating of Acts has huge implications. One clear fact is more valuable basis to go on than a whole lot of uncorroborated assumptions. So there are valid reasons for dating the writings of Luke and Acts. So there are valid reasons for dating the writing of the Gospel of Luke and of Acts to sometime after 62. John A.T. Robinson says pretty much the same thing. He talks about the odd fact that there is just no discussion of Jerusalem in any New Testament text. The destruction of Jerusalem is not mentioned as a completed event in any text. It's hinted at in Jesus' prophecy. It's hinted at in passages in Revelation, but it's always a prediction with never a narrative saying it's already taken place. Now, there are a lot of liberal, critical scholars who say, see, Luke does mention the destruction of Jerusalem. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, that's kind of hinted, this has already happened, except for the fact that even liberal guys like C.H. Dodd have argued that the language that Luke uses is just Greek versions of the Septuagint, the Old Testament prophecies about it. He said that in the 60s, or 40s even. A lot of liberals haven't focused on that. They say, no, and also there's no line in any of the Gospels of these things that happened in the days of Titus, nothing like that.
Shane, is this the crux of the matter? Like, we want the books written before AD 70 because, Jesus is prophesied.
Well, see, the thing is, the people I'm quoting here do not want it before 70. This goes against their thesis. They are leaving their territory. They're liberal. They have, they would prefer. He even says that. I'm not a conservative, and I'm just saying what makes the best sense. So for me, it fits better with a pre-70 date because that's when, you can still have eyewitness testimony in the 90s. So it's not like it has to be before 70. I just think it makes the best sense, particularly for the Theophilus thesis, Theophilus high priest, because he's dead before 67. So this information, I think, fits very well with the Theophilus assumption that Luke is writing Theophilus high priest, because it's before 70. He's no longer alive after 67. It is, of course, the destruction.
Do you think it's important that it was before the fall of Jerusalem?
I think Robinson is right. The entire New Testament was written before the fall of Jerusalem, including Revelation. I think Revelation is probably the later one, 68 something. Definitely while Nero is still in power. And I think there's arguments that we can talk about that after, if you want to come up and talk in person. The destruction of Jerusalem is, of course, predicted, he says, and these predictions are, in some case, at least assumed to be written or written of after the event. But the silence is nevertheless as significant as the silence for Sherlock Holmes' dog that did not bark. Explanations for the silence have, of course, been attempted, yet the simplest explanation of all, that perhaps there is extremely little the New Testament later than 70 AD, and then I must have missed a word or two there. And that its events are not mentioned because they had not yet occurred, seems to me to demand more attention than it has received in critical circles. John H.T. Robinson wrote another book after this in 1983. Posthumously, it was written because he died somewhere in the early 80s, I think. But that book is called The Priority of John, in which he argued that John was the earliest gospel. I don't necessarily follow him on that, but I do think it's definitely an early gospel. But most of the liberal scholars think, John is super late, and he said, no, it's got very marks of early and authentic caliber. John Wenham, I've mentioned him before, 1991, great English scholar. He's the father of David Wenham, another scholar today. He's writing an excellent book. He says, there are two considerations which bear on the question of whether the synoptics should be dated before or after 70. First is the dating of Jesus' eschatological discourse. That's his prophecy of things to come with the Jerusalem. Most scholars adopt a date after 70 for at least Matthew and Luke. But it needs to be said with great emphasis that on the face of it, nothing in the synoptics suggests this. The eschatological discourse foretells the shocking disaster which 40 years later was to engulf the Jewish people, yet none of them tells us that Jesus' prophecy was fulfilled. Luke tells us of the fulfillment of Agabus' prophecy of the worldwide famine, but of the fulfillment of the disaster which the Jews was incomparably greater, he says not a word. Last part here. For some 9 chapters, the book of Acts has been concerned, first of all, with the story of Luke's fateful visit to Jerusalem, which led to imprisonment and his appeal to Caesar, and then with the story of his journey to Rome. We are eager to know what happened at Paul's trial, but the author never tells us. This is what Adolf von Harnack was saying, 80 years earlier. He just says he lived there 2 whole years at his own expense and welcomed all who came to him. The only satisfying explanation of the writer's silence concerning the trial, it will be argued, is that when Luke wrote these closing lines, it still had not taken place. In other words, the end of the story gives us the date of the book, 62 CE. But Acts was preceded by an earlier treatise, the Gospel according to Luke, and thus it will be argued that it can be dated with some assurance in the early 50s. Once you start looking at the pattern of these kinds of things, like Luke is being quoted by Paul in Corinthians in the mid-60s, and he's not going to quote scripture like as if it was just adopted last Thursday. By the way, you find references to the scriptures in writings like Ignatius, who says Jesus was authorized by God and the apostles were authorized by Jesus, and therefore when we listen to their holy words, it's like, oh, okay. So even in Ignatius' early 2nd century, maybe even late 1st century, he certainly lived in the early 1st century, he's talking about the holy words of the apostles, which is why it's considered scripture from an early period. And think about Jesus' language. He commissions the 70, 72, and when they hear you, they hear me. Sounds like a good qualification for an evangelist to write a gospel. Carl Armstrong is, this book only came out a couple of years ago, 2021. I said 19, that dates me. This has never happened to you, where you say the year, but you start with 19. We can date Acts with relative certainty according to the people, places, and events that it describes. Okay? This is how we date lots of texts, right? You say, okay, let's just say I have no information about this new papyrus I discovered, and it says Julius Caesar is about to be attacked at the Ides of March. By the way, this really did happen. Shakespeare made it famous, but we actually find that Shakespeare was writing down real events. So if you find that he's leading up to the assassination but doesn't mention the assassination, you can kind of get a general feel for the timing and the dating by what he says and by what he leaves unsaid. A historical document can be placed in a historical context, whereas a literary creation is far more difficult to date. Okay? The literary creation, like Hansel and Gretel, are walking in the forest and they come to the witch's house. Tell me, when should I date this text? Have you been given any clues? Well, dating isn't even relevant in a fable like that. There have been a lot of scholars who argued, they're called form critics. The Gospels are certain forms and stories that have evolved over time, like Hansel and Gretel. It's kind of evolved over lots of tellings. The Grimm brothers put together these stories, but they were folk tales that went further back. But you can't date them. There's no geography, there's no temporal indicators in the text. Lots of geography and temporal indicators and names and ways to authenticate these narratives. And we can date them by the content. An analysis of the prologues indicate that Luke is more likely than not presenting himself as a participant beyond giving a simple literary impression. To some degree, this adds an extra layer to the reliability of the narrative, which in turn supports an early date. This is T. Clark. I mean, it's not a conservative printing house. There is a new trend among scholars to date things earlier. The incredible macabre picture of Rome in ashes, along with the multitudes of Christians that were killed under Nero, makes a later date for Acts increasingly difficult to maintain. Luke is a skillful writer, but it seems highly improbable that we can reconcile this hopeful and peaceful portrait at the end of Acts with a post-64 historical context. Think about that. Acts ends in this hopeful period, but just beyond it is this darkest, really dark, so dark it's like the darkest thing we can think of when we talk about a wicked ruler. We think of Nero. And then when we think about the harshest persecution, we think of the Neronic persecutions. One person who pushes back on this, who takes an early date, he pushes back on the argument from silence, but he says something interesting as well. Jonathan Verdier, if chronology is the proverbial backbone of history, then the study of Christian origins has developed scoliosis. It is, of course, quite true that the New Testament never refers to the fall of Jerusalem as a past event. He's interacting with John A.T. Robinson here. This book came out in 2022. It is the contention of this study that while there are New Testament books that contain material most fully intelligible only if written before 70, there are no New Testament books that contain material most fully intelligible if written after 70. By focusing on what the text do say, rather than what they do not say, we can come to this conclusion without falling into a fallacious argument from silence. He's one that argues that an argument from silence is a bit fallacious, and I think there are pregnant absences. I think the fact that, if the text does not, if it talks about the coming assassination of Caesar and never resolves that, okay, it's an argument from silence, but it at least generally puts the material here. I think I'm a little bit more open to having, especially when you see the New Testament as a whole. There was a dog that did not bark. I think it's informative. Verdier is a scholar who says, no, not a good. What is good to look at is what Luke does say. And he's convinced that what Luke does say puts it squarely before 70 AD. And here are some of the texts that go into it. You can look at the Annals of Tacitus and Clement of Rome, both of which talk about innumerable multitudes in Rome. Secular historian, Christian writer, both talk about that. Innumerable multitudes who were tortured. All right, before I wrap up, I want to talk about some summaries here. This is the implication. Theophilus the high priest, he is reigning as high priest from 37 to 41. He dies sometime before 67, because his brother was alive at that time. He's the last living son of Annas then. Here are some of the objections that people raise to this hypothesis that Theophilus is the one that Luke wrote to. Number one, we know that Luke was written in the 80s, 90s, or possibly later, so there's no way he could have written to Theophilus the high priest. Okay, so this is an objection I get a lot. And to me, you're taking the paradigm and you're judging the facts by the paradigm, which is the exact opposite of what you need to do. You need to take the evidence and challenge your paradigm. Start with evidence and build your paradigm from that. If you judge evidence and dismiss, okay, this piece of evidence cannot relate, goes out the door because we know. Yeah, but you know this by how? Does Luke say in the 70th year after? He doesn't say that. It's an inference based on evidence. So you can't just throw evidence out because it doesn't fit with your paradigm. Sometimes anomalies to a paradigm will overthrow the paradigm. Now, the fact that people know this shows bias. A lot of people know, they just know that Luke was written in the 80s, 90s, 100. Here's a study that was recently done. A survey of modern scholarship pertaining to the authorship, dating, and sources of Luke Acts. Matt Hill did this research project. He surveyed over 400 scholars and writers who took a position on the date of Luke and Acts. Scholars who wrote from, say, the 1960s to the present. And later, he ended up narrowing his project down to specialists, those who had a PhD in the field of the New Testament or something related, and who took a position on the date. And his results were only 6% dated after 100. This is being revived now because Josephus wrote his text in 1995, and some of his later texts in 95 to 100. And there are people arguing that Luke is borrowing language from Josephus. Of course, it could be the other way around too. It could be that Josephus is borrowing language from Luke. But they don't take that into consideration. They say, we know Luke used language from Josephus, therefore he's really late. 6% think it was after 100. 51% put it between 70 and 100. And 43, look, that's almost half. It's a very vibrant scholarly debate. We have the minority position, but sometimes, like with Einstein, the minority ends up becoming the new majority later. The question isn't, you don't count heads to determine truth, but still, you shouldn't start with the assumption we know it's late. Well, not everybody knows it's late. A lot of liberals opted out of that view, as we've seen. So this is a good number to just tell people, did you know that almost half, by the way, when Matt surveyed 400 scholars and did the math on that one, the numbers were pretty much the same. And this is not, one person when I used this data said, oh, well, how many of those people that put it before 70 had to sign a statement of faith, in order to work at the institution? Okay, so okay, how many people are possibly in a school where they're not allowed to challenge the liberal dating side of things? That's not actually engaging with the data and the evidence. It's what C.S. Lewis called bulverism. Look that one up. It's a logical fallacy. Second objection. Alternative views of Theophilus include, we looked at a pseudonym, the patron, the unknown Gentile ruler, specific ruler. One specific ruler that I didn't talk about is a new book by a guy named Michael Cooper wrote a recent book, just came out this year. And he argues that there's extra biblical information, inscription in Ephesus to Theophilus. And he was probably a high priest in Ephesus who maybe converted. We can place Luke in Ephesus. And so he makes this case, he writes a chapter about it in his recent book. And I told him, I had a conversation with him about it. He reached out to me and we talked. I said, if I hadn't done any research, I would probably think this is the most plausible view of all the positions that I've looked at so far, because he makes a good case connecting a person who could be noble, the way the inscription reads. He's in a city but the thing is, he doesn't connect. It's a plausible connection, but there's no actual linkage between, did Luke know this person? We put him in the same city. That's the best we can do. That's plausible. It is a Theophilus. So it's a different Theophilus, but the argument that I'm advocating is we can make a connection to Luke and this high priest through Paul's connection. Very plausible connection. And when you combine other things like he's in the right city, he's in the right place, right time, involved in the trial of Jesus, got a granddaughter named Joanna. I think the case becomes more than plausible, but even probable and likely. Third, if this ossuary belonged to Luke's Joanna, it surely wouldn't have mentioned Cusa. Why doesn't the ossuary mention Cusa? Joanna, wife of Cusa, certainly you're going to mention Cusa's name. Well, turns out, after looking at this one, taking a deep dive, Tal Long argues in one of her books that the majority of people who die are named with their fathers, not their husbands. That's just the way the ossuaries work. So you might have a certain assumption, and a lot of people make this argument. Barag and Flusser mentioned this in their piece that came out in 1985, that she doesn't look like she had a husband, otherwise he would have been mentioned. And people reference that, like, well, it doesn't mention the husband. A couple things. It could be that when she died, they had been divorced for a long time, he'd been dead for a long time. It also, well, when I read Tal, that the overwhelming majority of women who died were named associated with fathers. It's because it's connecting you to the family of, the biological family of, especially in the priesthood, because you want to connect you to this, the priestly line. All right, so last one. The family chronology of the family of Annas and Theophilus does not line up. I get this a lot. Doesn't line up. And the reason it doesn't line up for a lot of people is that according to various online sources, including the Jewish Encyclopedia, Annas was born in 22 BC. Now, if that's the case, this would make him 49 in 28 BC, 28 AD, sorry. That's the beginning of Jesus' ministry. So if you say 18 roughly to try and make it fit, because the average generation, my generation, if I go back, I was old enough to know my great-grandmother. I have a picture where I'm like 22, 23 with an 85-year-old great-grandmother. But that's because I have 22-year generation gaps, in my family line anyway, 21, 22. Here, if we make it 18, because they married earlier in those days, then you'd get, the father would be 31, John would be 13, that doesn't look good, right? And so I had to do a deep dive into this one too, and it's a big problem for some people, unless you've been nerdy like me and you do the research and you say, okay, so what is this number here rooted in? 22 BC. Well, people start there because that's what the internet says. But you know what? I did a show on Billy Joel that people say on the internet that he did the executive room piano sessions here, and the internet was wrong. My dad was right. That's the kind of thing I do. I don't take, I'm skeptical of like, do we really know that for sure? Let's dig into it. So it turns out when you look at the sources for the Jewish Encyclopedia, it cites Josephus, and it says in his 37th year, which we know he became high priest this year, in his 37th year, he became high priest, so therefore that corresponds to 22 BC. But you look at Josephus, he talks about the 37th year of the Olympiad, not associated with a birthday for Annas at all. So it's a conflation of, whoever did that encyclopedia article was totally off base. It says nothing about the birth year of Annas, and therefore, if you also have him be born in 22, guess what that means? It means he's not even 30 years old at the time when he became high priest. I'm going to be putting my book, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and a few other sources make clear you've got to be 30 minimum to become a priest. Minimum. There are some texts in the Old Testament where it talks about the Levites assisting, and one text says 30, another text says 25, another text says 20. The 25 and 20 are, of course, no, the 20-year-old one happens in the days of King David, but it's Levites assisting high priests, not high priests, not priests. The information about the high priesthood, the sons of Aaron, is a different category altogether. All right, now, you got to be 30 minimally. So Annas would not have been 30, and his son becomes high priest 10 years later, and he would definitely be early 20s. So you got to start with factoring in his son. If he's going to be 30 here, that would mean Annas has to be what age here minimally? And then you work back, and after doing that, I figured out Annas would have to be this age. He's got to be born at the very earliest 35 BC, which makes everything work magically, especially if you recognize the fact that this is going to sound weird, but when you travel to other places, things are weird. They have weird customs. When you travel in time, it gets even weirder. So the marriage custom in ancient Israel was, it was shameful if your family did not marry off your daughter before they turned 13. Now, that was betrothal, so they would be betrothed at the latest 12 and a half, and then married by 13 and a half at the latest. Otherwise, it's scandalous, and essentially, marriage is associated with puberty. Now, in some cases, you find Jewish texts talking about men being married. This is a rabbinic discussion, which there's a varied opinion. Some of the Talmudic passages say 18 for men. So you can have the men working for a bit, earning the money for the dowry and all that stuff, but that wasn't the case for the aristocrats because they didn't need to work to get the dowry. So what you find Josephus saying is they married at puberty. He talks about this, I'll cite it in my book. He says Bernice, okay, we know Bernice from the book of Acts. She's the sister of Agrippa II, the second Agrippa. They're there at the trial of Paul. She was married at age 16. And then you read a couple chapters later, it was her second marriage. She was married first at 13. And then later he talks about another Aristobulus or somebody who was married in puberty. So the normal way of thinking for aristocrats was marriage at puberty. And if you see the sons of Annas, you plot them out. Okay, this one Eleazar is first, Jonathan is second, so-and-so here, the daughter who marries Caiaphas, then Theophilus, then you just map it out. It's pretty easy to calculate the times and then see corresponding to how they become priests. They're all priests, they become high priests after age 30, and everything works out. My calculations, in light of a lot of research, shows that Joanna could have been anywhere from 0 to 27. 27 on the assumption that she was like Theophilus. We know he was born around such time based on the calculations. But then firstborn son John, firstborn daughter Joanna. Not as likely. It could be that they're going to be second or third born. So instead of being 13-year gap and 13-year gap, maybe it's 18-year gap, 18-year gap, but it still works out fine where they would be of marriageable age. It's kind of weird thinking of Joanna as being 13 to 15 to 17 as a woman, married woman following Jesus. When I first heard that Mary could have been a teenager, I immediately rejected it out of my mind, and that's too weird. No, that can't be. It can't be because I'm judging the past by present assumptions and expectations, not allowing for the weirdness of the ancient world. Guess what? The modern way of life, where we delay marriage well beyond puberty, is the exception to the rule. Most of the world was marriage at puberty. Most of the ancient world is that way. It was only that way up until recently, actually. You start looking at Civil War era, 8th grade, last school, then you go off to work. That's only 14. And you go off to work and start getting married at that time. That's here in this country. So yeah, world is weird. Anyway, those are the objections that I try to engage with. I will be writing a new chapter in my book that where I walk through those objections. And if you have any objections or any questions, let's do that now as we wrap up. Yes, sir.
So Josephus is, man, he's important. Probably a whole seminar, in my opinion. Can you just give us a thumbnail on what you think he contributes to the kind of scholarship you're doing? And was he beloved by Jews, Romans? What is?
Yeah. When I've read books on hermeneutics, how do you interpret the text? One really good book on hermeneutics is by Berkhoff, Louis Berkhoff, and he says a lot of people make the mistake of trying to make try to make the text relevant for the audience. Like, I'm gonna try to make this fit, I'm gonna take the language and make it translate it into your world and experience. He says that's exactly the opposite way you should do it. You should take the people and say, come with me on a journey, and take them to the first century. And Josephus really helps us to do that. He helps us to see the text in its context. And when you see the text in its context, that's when language and phrases and people become, oh wait, this, so you're saying Herod the Great hung out with Cleopatra? Now you have, okay, these are real people, and I didn't know, I knew Cleopatra from the play of Shakespeare, but I didn't know that she came to Judea and hung out with Herod. And now you start to see everything that happens here, there's just more to the story. We just read from a passage where King Herod Agrippa writes a letter, and we have more information about that guy. Well, if you are interested in the field of the New Testament, Josephus is essential reading. Essential reading. Really just essential reading in terms of understanding that background, especially if you're a scholar. Just filling out the details. How is he viewed? Jews in particular kind of treat him as a traitor. But I think that the reason he ended up siding with Rome was not because he was a traitor. He recognized his own people had caused their zealous nature, trying to fulfill these things themselves, some of it rooted in messianic ideas. They were trying to fulfill these things and ended up, causing the conflagration. He keeps saying, God destroyed Jerusalem through the Romans. He would say things like this, which is why when I was in a Jewish context, I do remember a few times people saying how, the Romans, how wicked they were. Nobody said God did this to the Jewish nation. You'd hear about Masada and all the wicked things the Romans did. And no, Josephus argued that this was the punishment that he came to conclude. This was the hand of God and rooted in messianic prophecy. He says things like, if you read the books of Daniel, it says that the Romans will come and destroy Jerusalem. And there are other things Daniel says about the future that I can't talk about, but if you want, you should go read the books of Daniel. He says that. And he's hinting at the Jewish messianic beliefs of what his views were. He's very veiled about. Richard Bauckham has a fascinating new book out, 3 or 4 years old, called The Son of Man. And he gets into that. Like, what did Josephus say? What were his views about prophecy? What was his views about Jesus? He's kind of not saying a lot about Jesus because he's keeping his cards close at hand because he's at Rome. And messianic ideas is about kingship, but there is a king of the world over here. And so we're going to say as little as possible. That's Baukham's view. It's very interesting. Does that answer your question? Any other thoughts, questions, comments?
Yeah, I noticed that the James ossuary says James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus.
It does, and there are some who argue that that is authentic, and some are a bit more open. I think it's authentic. I think when the work was done on the patina, it seems to say that this is not a fake, and there are triangulations you can make between, how many Jacob is the name. In English it's James. Jacob, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. That means that the Jesus very rarely put a brother in there. So it's a famous brother, and then his father named Joseph. So then that's a pretty good, just doing the math, it's calculations. I think it's probable that it's the right James, because this was a James of. We don't notice that much in the New Testament, but if you look at church history, there's a huge echo of James' importance in the early church, and he kind of fills the void once Peter leaves, which makes sense if you think about it from the royal perspective, like the brother of the king. And yet there's no mention of anything supernatural or even kingly about James. But it's like, here, you take the office. We're going to give you all this respect, which makes sense if your brother was the Messiah and he's now a believer. He could tell us about things that Jesus said from his lifetime too. So Yeah, so I think that ossuary is probably the right James. And it's the first extra biblical inscription related to Jesus. There's another inscription in the Talpiot tomb that a lot of people think is a reference to the family of Jesus. And some have argued in a conservative direction that it's plausible that it may be the right. It's not, that there are interesting ways to think of it like there are people who have taken it in an atheistic direction. This is the tomb of Jesus. And there are others who've taken it in another direction, like this is the bone box that was made for Jesus after his death that was never filled.
Yeah.
Because you have the body in the tomb, it's time. What you do is, once you have the body in the tomb, is you go get the ossuary ready, you carve the initials on, you put it there, and then a year later you come and you put the bones in the box. So there are other family names that are interesting there. And so some have argued that instead of arguing that it points in an atheistic direction, it is also connected with the family of Jesus, but it was never filled. In fact, there are ways to test if a bone box has had bones. The darker material at the bottom of the thing, as the bones deteriorate, it affects the bottom of the box. There's nothing like that in this bone. It's never filled with bones. I'm open to that possibility. I'm not sure yet.
That's all Tabor, though.
What's that?
That's all Tabor writing that stuff, right?
No, that's Tabor is one of the guys who's
He's a
like
Talpiot.
he's the Talpiot tomb. He writes about it. And he's an advocate of it being authentic,
Yeah.
showing that Jesus really did die and never was resurrected. I don't think, even if it is authentically Jesus' box, I think it proves he wasn't ever put in there. His bones were never there. Yeah.
Your last slide with the family tree,
Uh-huh.
you had mentioned previously that John, who's listed there, is likely the author of the Johann, writings in the New Testament.
I do think that's a possibility. I have argued in a couple of different places that he is certainly this Theophilus. It doesn't say Joanna, the granddaughter of Theophilus. It says Joanna, the daughter of Yehohanan, daughter of Yehohanan, son of Theophilus the high priest. And that Yehohanan is John. That's how we would say it. And that John is definitely a high priestly lineage. And there are two sources, ancient sources, that sort of connect John, the gospel writer, with the high priestly family. One is the Gospel of John itself. The beloved disciple is known to the high priest and has access to the court of the high priest. The other one is Polycrates, who says that John, the writer of the gospel, wore the high priestly frontlet. Like, whoa, that sort of connects. And so this is a John who fits that bill. So I have argued that this is possibly that Joanna, Theophilus, Joanna, and John, Theophilus, John, and Joanna, could be a family of faith, or at least the two could be. That's interesting. Another possible candidate, though, is John Mark. John Mark is a Levite. He's mentioned in the book of Acts. He lives in a gated home, probably the home where the upper room was gathered, and probably is related to Barnabas. I think there's connections in Acts where it says that. So he's a Levite, and he seemed to be wealthy. So there are some extra biblical information about him too that seems to be provocative. There's a book that was written about it. If you're interested, I'll give you the details. I'm not sure which is the better. I think there's even one more possibility. I think I am open to both positions, and I haven't sort of leaned on one or the other. I think they're both possible. Okay. So John Mark. Mark is just the Latin name, and often that was the case. You would have a totally different Latin name than your Hebrew name. So John Mark, sometimes it'll say John Mark, his other name is Mark, that kind of stuff. But other places he's just called John. John, it's priestly John, and so I don't know. I'm open.
So that John Mark is not the Mark the writer of the
Some people make that connection, and I've after seeing some of the scholarship on that, I changed positions. I think it's not Mark. I think it's definitely this guy, because of the priestly connections. The Mark who's associated in the earliest Christian history is translator Peter. He's connected to him in Rome. He's not a Jew who is living in Jerusalem. And yeah, I think that's a different Mark. And Mark's a pretty common name, but John Mark, and seeing the priestly connections and how that echoes throughout early church history, I think there's a lot of good evidence to suggest that John Mark could be the beloved disciple. Again, I think stuff gets lost in history, and it's hard. You have to look at history, especially 2,000-year-old history, as being a puzzle that, if you're putting together a puzzle with, it's 1,000 pieces of the puzzle, we probably have 30%, maybe even 10% of the original. And so sometimes because of that, we have missing information. And so we put too much emphasis on these particular pieces, and we get a distorted view of the original. So that's why I think we should be humble and say, it's a guess. When you get to the Old Testament period, now it's like, instead of 10%, it's more like 1%. We don't have the entire picture. We have this one puzzle piece in terms of extra biblical information. It's harder to make connections. And yet I think some fascinating connections have been made. Any other thoughts or comments before we end the day?
Yeah, there's an extra scriptural or writing of Jesus or of his name in that synagogue that they just uncovered, equating him to being God. Did you find research that lately?
Which one are you referring to?
It's in Israel, and it equates Jesus as being God.
Yeah, most of the ones that I've seen where you see those equations, there's usually 2nd, 3rd century. So I'm one of these guys that looks for 1st century connections. So sometimes I'll see those. Yeah, it's pretty interesting, but a lot of people have said that in the 3rd century kind of.
Yeah, this one's old. It's like super important.
Okay, I'll remind me of that and send me the link. I'll take a look at it. Did anybody learn? Was there a hand over here? Did anybody learn something here that they hadn't heard before? Yeah. Anybody bored to death? No comment. All right. Well, it's been a pleasure to be back with you. Next year, we'll have to celebrate our 5 years if I get invited back. Assuming. It's been a pleasure just working through this material. I didn't have a lot of, if you notice, not a lot of heart to my presentations. Sometimes I'll have more fancy slides, but I finished my video project, and then it's like, okay, time to start working on slides. I've got a lot of data in my head, a lot of notes in my book, but it's like, how do I take all of this knowledge in a couple of days here, day and a half, and present it in slides? And so I hope it was coherent, but I'm excited about this stuff because I think it really does change the way we read Luke. I've not heard contemporary apologists make the case that Luke was an eyewitness. And yet, I think there have been previous centuries in which the presidents of Oxford have been arguing this because the Greek says this. It makes that case that he was present from the beginning. And I think if we see that, that makes sense in light of what Jesus said. His advocates would go and tell his story because they were with him from the beginning. He qualifies as a witness, and that's what he's saying others have done, and that's what I'm going to do for you, Theophilus. I think it's the best way to read the language of the text, and I think it totally changes the way we read this as an affidavit submitted to the high priest. And I'm excited to tell the world about it, and thanks for letting me tell you.
That part is good, but doesn't Luke interview Mary and everything too? That's what we're always taught.
We don't know that he interviews Mary. One of the key ways we know that he may have interviewed Mary is that language that she held this in her heart. She treasured this in her heart. Like, how do you know what went on in her heart?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's possible that he got that directly from Mary, but it's also possible that he got it from James. Mm-hmm. You could make a connection either way, because he certainly would have remembered that story. And he could have related that to Luke. So there's very easy ways for Luke to get that, either from Mary directly or from the son who heard the story all his life. So we don't know that he interviews Mary. There are early church records, like hints here and there, allusions. There are a lot of books we have that are lost, but we'll have quotes from the books that are lost and little lines. One of the lines is that Mary was only 14 when she had Jesus and she died when she was 45 or something like that. So if she was 30 at the time of, the crucifixion, she dies 15 years later. So it's possible that's right. It depends on where Luke is, like where is she in hiding? Where's the beloved disciple keeping her? Does Luke have access to her? If he doesn't have access to her, he certainly has access to James. So I'm open to a bunch of possibilities.
I could do this to you all day. Thank you so much, everyone, for being a part of this. And let's give Shane a nice